So, how much? I didn't know Charles well, but well enough to guess that the grizzled hog farmer was a talented salesman. No lowballs, I imagined him drawling, waggling his finger and speaking over his exceptionally jutting chin. $350 for the land, the pen, and the house, the man said. He spat hard, and the tobacco black phlegm stuck to the side of the fence post and slowly ran down the side in 3 rivulets. Then another 20 grand for the hogs. 235 of them, not a large parcel. Price of swine is going up, I'll tell you, so 'tis the best I can give you for what you's gettin'. I'd expected to hand him even more money. Charles and his wife had a small operation, but big enough to matter, with a beautiful 2-story farmhouse to accompany it nicely. I wasn't getting a better deal anywhere else, at least not anywhere I wanted to be. I'd longed to live as a farmer in Tennessee ever since my family's entire property burned to the ground back in the fall of '68. It was dry and we'd just fertilized after the harvest. Not a living thing was left untouched by the flames, not even my father, who ran back to get the horses after the barn shot up with a pillar of fire. We never found his body. Or maybe we did. But the charred dust of the barn, the corn, and the animals we called our lives, and the blackened remains of the man that was my world, were all reduced to ashes in the end. And when the wind came, they all blew away just the same, forever to leave me, my 2 sisters, and my mother behind. I held up my hand to Charles, and we shook on it. It wasn't the life I envisioned for myself, not when I got my engineering degree from Georgia Tech, not when I began to work at a small engineering firm. Not even when I saw the hog farm for sale less than an hour from my house did I realize that that was the world I lost that I needed back. My wife didn't care. In fact, it brought her work commute down to 40 minutes from an hour 10. After we moved there and I began consulting part-time to make allowances for the time I needed to spend raising the hogs, caring for the land, and tending to my now pregnant wife, the fulfillment I sought seemed that much closer, but only that. Closer, yet still out of the reach of my yearning clutches. It wasn't until 2 years after I bought the farm, almost to the day, that the chips seemed to fall on my side with her. "Micah," Jackie was calling from the cubicle over. Then I heard footsteps coming toward my own office space. "Hey, yeah, did you finish the drainage plans for the floodplain you were working on? If so, I'd happily review and sign off on them." Jackie had come here a couple of years after I did. She was an intern at first, and everyone loved her cheery smile and sharp intellect. So she was hired on after she finished her degree. The youngest of our crew, she lived by herself in an apartment, but her lack of experience didn't keep her from coolly sharing her opinion on matters of work when she knew she was right, and she was always right. Jackie had always taken a liking to me in a way she didn't seem to show toward the others. I never became sure of why she did, but I had my suspicions. Trauma and mystique go hand in hand. Maybe she saw me as broken in the same way she saw herself. After all, it didn't take a psychologist to tell Jackie had her own skeletons in her closet. She just had that aura, the one that neglected children and broken adults share with each other. Nobody knew what life she walked out of, and nobody cared. She did her job, and that was all the company cared for. But not me. I turned away from my computer screen towards the opening of my cubicle, and she was there, half silhouetted by the light behind her, staring me in the eye. Jackie trailed a finger down the edge of the cubicle wall, her mouth open barely enough for me to see her tongue flit deftly over her perfectly aligned incisors. Ignoring my question, she continued, "Your wife, I take it?" She gestured with an outstretched palm toward the wedding photo I had framed on my desk. "Yeah. Hard to believe we'll be a family of 3 soon." I chuckled nervously, slightly excitedly too. I can't tell if Jackie knew that the latter was for what I knew was coming rather than what I had already said, but I don't think she would have cared one way or the other. "Say, she must be lonely waiting for you at home. I know that feeling, being lonely." She took a step toward me and I glanced down at my feet. Looking back, it felt like an eternity. That looking down, that knowing what was happening and making a decision, it was a choice. And while it felt like it stretched for minutes, hours, I knew it was but a moment, yet it only took a moment to make my descent into sin. "I know it too. Well, too well. She's on a business trip, a long one. Say, I raise hogs. Prize swine. There's good money in them. What do you say about coming to see my farm sometime? It had been 2 hours since Jackie had left the farmhouse, and it was almost 1:30 in the morning. Yet I wasn't tired. According to my doctor, I have insomnia. According to my mother, I have bad juju. According to myself, well, I guess I just don't feel like sleep is worth the trouble sometimes. That night, though, I didn't sleep at all until the sun shone through my window in the early hours of the morning. Living among swine never gave me a lot of grief before then. Some people hated the stench, my wife among them. But the manure never bothered me, and come to find out, it didn't bother Jackie either. I would have asked if she'd been on a farm as a child, but her demeanor and attitude told me that she wasn't interested in the slightest in my life, and that I shouldn't be in hers either. I suppose I wasn't. Not in the one outside of our affair, at least. But that night, when the stars were out and shining like eyes in a limitless black sea, and when the wind rustled through the trees, a gigantic army moving across the land like a plague towards destinations unseen, I started to feel bothered in a way I never had before. I'd been sitting on the back porch in view of the pig pens after having just finished the chores. I knew I wasn't drunk. I was only on my second beer, but sitting outside, half-empty bottle in hand, I suddenly wished I could be completely wasted. I'd never been one to believe in those types of things that you can't touch with your hand or see with your eyes. The hair stood up on my arms, and the taste of metal lapped my tongue as if a storm was coming. No, I didn't believe in the things you couldn't really feel, but I could sure as hell feel something now. Unsettled, I was turning around to go get another beer before something caught my eye in the pig pen that made me glance over. All of the pigs visible from this side of the house could be seen, through the metal fencing, staring in my direction. The ones who were blocked by the lumpy bodies of the other swine stood on the hind ends of the others to see. With their combined mass, the pigs strained the metal of the pen stalls until each stall's fencing bulged out in the middle where the weight was distributed. Most unique of all was the unanimous behavior of the swine. Not one fell out of sync. Each one, eyes glowing like headlights in the dark, bodies silhouetted against the light of the moon, was without noise or disturbance. Once all of the pigs were in position, they all stayed ominously still. As I watched, one by one, hundreds of eyes closed and a wave of darkness spread over the pen as no more eyes were open to reflect the light. I swore for a moment that the stars did too, and that the world around me plunged into complete darkness. But I could not be for certain, because at that same moment, I involuntarily blinked. I say involuntarily because, frozen in place, the scene was too strange for me to willingly turn away from. I do not know if the same force that caused the swine to flicker their eyes caused me to do the same, perhaps a gust of wind or of something less tangible. But upon opening them, the pigs had returned to their discord, with several already having gone to sleep. Deeply disturbed, I went inside the house and drank until the morning came, and I finally found sleep. My wife returned from her trip soon enough and without much ado upon her arrival. For the next month or so, the two of us were together, and our lives were lived without significant discord. None that she knew about, anyway. I never told her about Jackie, and I certainly didn't mention the times I saw my co-worker after my wife returned, either. And while I did float an innocent question to her, asking if she had noticed any of the hog's strange behavior, I didn't enlighten her as to the motivation for my interrogative manner. She never appreciated being in the company of swine as it was, and turning her disdain into disgust wasn't on my agenda. Almost as abruptly as she'd returned, my wife left again, to be gone for the next week and a half on another trip. Probably best for her, too, because the hottest days of the year hit western Tennessee when she wasn't there to experience them, and no sooner had she gone than Jackie resumed her nightly visits to the farm. Each time she showed up without much notice, if any at all, and left just as abruptly. Funnily enough, I didn't care much. I felt no more and no less empty after she left than when she was here. So after I spent my days with my eyes on my screen and my nose in my boss's ass, I spent my nights staring up through the bottoms of bone-dry bottles faintly wondering if the path I walked down could have been just a little warmer or just a little brighter if things were different. In spite of my catering towards my boss's every wish at the office, he didn't return the goodwill in kind. "What do you mean you're asking for a raise?" I swallowed and continued. "I mean that it's been 5 years, Glenn. I simply asked that my pay might increase to match inflation." My boss folded his hands across his desk and sighed. Pulling a handkerchief from his pocket, he dabbed at a couple of beads of sweat running down from his brow. We were in the heat of summer, and the air hung thick and humid around us. The office had air conditioning, but the unit was old, and the fan whistling away in the corner didn't do much good against the record-breaking heat pressing in around us. "I'm sorry, Micah. It's just that you're consulting now, and I can't afford you those kind of benefits." "What do you mean, benefits? I've been here long enough. I'm owed at least that, Glenn. What the fuck do you think I'm still here for? Potlucks?" That was the first time I had lost my temper at my boss. At least the first time since he ripped up one of my drafts for a project several years back. That had been a long day for both of us. Now Glenn sat back and scowled ever so slightly, and only for a brief moment, an indication that his inhibitions keeping his attitude in check were wearing thin. Nonetheless, he put on a smile and chuckled coldly. "Micah, look, you were always my right-hand man, but you're here so little now. One could say you're more like my right thumb man now." That was a long day, too. The heat didn't help. Somehow some bugs got into the office. Somebody probably left the door open to quash the heat, fruitlessly. No wonder the AC shot, I thought to myself. By the time it was the hour for me to leave, there were moths flitting around the lights, flies eating the stale food in the cafe, gnats alighting on every exposed surface in the office. Insects were everywhere. I figured that door must have been left open most of the day. Gotta be pretty stupid bugs if this is where they want to be. The time came for me to leave, and I did so without a fuss. As little as I could manage, anyway. I took time to complete some errands and returned home, only to realize the heat wasn't much less oppressive there than it was at the office, even if there weren't any insects. If anything, it felt oddly empty without them, even after Jackie showed up. The rest of that evening was a blur of empty bottles and used cigarette butts littering the porch. At some point, 2 in the morning, 3, it didn't matter, I was pulled out of my drunken slumber and forced into sobriety by a noise I could no more determine the source of than what I had eaten for dinner a year ago from the day. I sat up with a jolt and listened, suddenly feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The sound, if it could be called that, was discordant, unnatural, wrong, and yet I couldn't remember another thing about it. It wasn't a sound heard through your ears, a vibration in your skin, nor even a sensation of one's physical brain. It was a thought processed through one's sleeping soul, something that certainly cannot be described with words without diminishing the weightiness placed, without negating, in full, the sense of abject horror at its state of being. I had sat atop that precipice between reality and unreality, sleep, the abyss, where devils absently play among the nightmares of men. I told myself it was just that, a dream, but I know now that the place I was and the places I was soon to go were gateways between the waking world and the one beneath it. Before I had time to process what I had just felt, I heard another sound, this one very much real, and resembling a dying animal. Slowly, I made my way out of my crumpled bed and opened the blinds. I almost wished, upon doing so, that I was back on the precipice. 13 of the hogs stood in a circle on the lawn. How they'd gotten out, I don't know. Each stood perfectly still, equidistant from the next, and faced a quivering shadow in the middle of them all. I could make out faint features, a scraggly beard, a bottle. Whether the man was a hiker or a drunk, I couldn't tell. Nonetheless, he had wound up on my property and found himself caught in a circle of pigs. I watched the man's motions and noted with rising horror that, as he walked in one direction, the circle of pigs shifted to keep him at the center of the ring, and all the while, they drew nearer to him. The man was clearly intoxicated now. It was almost half a minute before he stumbled, fell, and no sooner squelched in the dirt than 13 squeals rang through the night, and the animals blotted out his body from sight with their unified mass. The man let out one scream, but could manage no more than that. The ring was a blur of motion. I saw little, but I saw enough. One pig reared its glistening head, and I watched part of a scalp fly from its gaping mouth, arcing dark liquid as it trailed across the yard. Another couple chunks of meat rolled away from the pile and reached a stop several feet away in the yard. Once the pigs were through with their feast, they broke off from the previous sight, now nothing but a red stain on the earth, and gobbled up the pieces that had got away. It took me the next 4 hours to get the pigs back into their pen, but I managed it, and none had to be shot in the process, though I surmised I should come with a gun readied. A cleanup wasn't necessary either. It was a hog farm, so it'd be getting dirty again soon. I considered another individual might find the stain, but there was no proof it was human blood, and I had no intention of calling the police out there. That morning, my boss was late to work. I suppose that's to be expected, though, when one has had their tires slashed. He was livid, and I didn't correct his supposition that his ex-wife had committed the act, though I'm sure he would have loved another reason to fire me. After all, I was nothing more than a right thumb man. The day had gone quicker and cooler than the former, and the low droning of the rain made the day seem just a little less lonely. Of course, I was slated to see Jackie that night, and after lunch, I had left work, gone off to purchase more drinks from the local liquor store. I remember having gotten enough to fill the passenger seat of my truck, and felt almost as if the pile of liquor was a singular being, watching me, the silently judgmental friend. I had a twinge of anxiety, and half wondered if I was going insane. At that, I laughed. The air was cool when Jackie got there. My mother always used to call that the first breath of autumn, when the reaper opened his eyes and cooed softly to his crop before the inferno was snuffed out under the frigid winter. As a child, I didn't pay much attention to her words, but as I grew older, I felt the cold in my bones, and tonight I felt it in my soul, a faint whisper of death, like the mark of the beast. I watched Jackie's hair whip to the side, a black flag in the wind as she approached the house. On the doorstep, we embraced, and I recall she said she needed to talk. "You're an awfully successful man, Micah, and I know you've got a lot of money. Maybe you're not wealthy, no, but you're richer than me, and there's enough to go around. It'd be a damn shame if your poor wife found out about me. No, I haven't said a thing yet, and I know you know that, for the poor thing couldn't take the stress and might just die. But I could say a thing, and maybe even a little more, and a nasty thing it'd be too. I just ask for 1,000 a month, but times are tough, so I'm inclined to say 2,000 would be enough to keep my mouth shut. And of course, we could continue seeing each other, if you'd so please." Some say they see red when they're angry enough, but I still remember how I saw even less. The next 5 minutes of my life were no clearer to me than several brief glimpses of reality interspersed by periods of unreality before the next glimpse. A scream and then another. The thought, "She's got a knife." A bone snapped. Mine, hers, it didn't matter. Blood, spattered on the carpet, on my shirt, and the drip, drip of a glistening red globe, smashed in through the side like a cracked egg. I remember the silence before the adrenaline eased, and I felt pain. And I remember the pain before the squelch, when I issued one last kick to the body lying on the ground. It had been time for me to feed the pigs. Jackie usually helped me with the feeding when she came over, always with a coy look, and often it was short-lived and I needed to finish the job on my own after she left. I was betting that she could help me again. Hoisting her up onto my shoulders wasn't difficult, though I suppose she was lighter than usual. I stooped to pick up the last few pieces that didn't come with the rest of her, and took the two of us to our yard. The part of the brain we, as people, already understand cannot possibly encompass every situation which we, as people, feel. Scientifically, maybe, but that feeling that makes dogs bark at empty rooms, that makes cats stare into walls before jumping away, frightened. That feeling exists in humans, too. Call it a sixth sense, or ESP. It's there, and I felt it when carrying Jackie. The birds had stopped calling, the trees had ceased rustling, and a low, droning buzz resounded outside the pig pen. It rose in volume and pitch, and as I dropped Jackie's lifeless corpse onto the ground, it blocked entirely the noise of the world around me. I didn't even hear the thump, nor did I hear the pigs, for it wasn't until I looked up from her body, panting heavily from the effort of what had transpired, that I saw that we stood on the fringe of a gathering of the pigs. I couldn't see if any remained in the pen, but I could see that at least 100 gathered here outside the pen, all staring at me with glassy eyes and salivating mouths. Some stood on the haunches of the others to see, and many were covered in blood, having been left unclean since the events of the previous night. Even through the foggy daze I was in, my fear registered on a guttural level, and, in horror at the unreality of what I was seeing, I backpedaled, eventually tripping over a rut in the earth and falling to the ground. The next moment, each of the pigs had turned to look at what was left of Jackie. For a couple of seconds, they stared at her, and I realized that the droning in my ears had stopped, replaced with nothing but an ominous silence. That silence was short-lived, for in one unanimous ear-splitting squeal, the pigs raced each other to the body, and carnage ensued. The hogs in front no sooner reached the body than were ripped apart by the pigs behind them. Huge flaps of fatty skin hung in ribbons from the napes of their necks, and blood sprayed in all directions as necks, limbs, tails, and extremities were mangled with the reckless abandon of a pack of wild dogs. I suppose that's what they were. Even if I treated them like domesticated creatures, they were animals, and they were out of the control of any constraints that civilization wanted to place on them. The mass of flesh moved rhythmically, and dripping bodies were flung like oversized rag dolls from the fray to land wetly and lifelessly on the earth. Occasionally I would hear a crunch as bones were rent and snapped under the pressure of the fray, and squeals as the broken limbs stabbed through the fleshy bodies of the animals atop them. Hooves, teeth, and bones carved the flesh of the other pigs, and while blood and feces sprayed freely, chunks of gore rolled out of the fray like meaty baseballs. The pleasant temperature drop had undone itself as the wind had stopped blowing, and the stench of the scene hung thick in the hot and heavy air of late summer. I vomited, over and over, bent over in the shit and the blood, eyes watering from the smell, and blood dripped from everywhere on my body. It ran off my body in rivulets and pooled around my feet. Some was mine, but more was Jackie's, and yet more was the remains of the pigs. Blood dripped from my mouth onto the dirt, and I could no longer tell if I was looking up toward the cruel stars, down at the earth, or witnessing the slaughter before me, for my sight was veiled by a coating of blood, and my senses were clouded by the rush of adrenaline, though I could do nothing but sit in shock. Breathe. A chunk of meat smacked me in the shoulder. Breathe. An ear bounced off my forehead. Breathe. An opened artery sprayed blood across my face in a line. Breathe. My eyes recognized 4 pigs on the fringe of the conflict, abandoning their course for what was left of Jackie, and I saw turn to me, each foaming at the mouth like a rabid animal. I saw 2 get ripped away by 2 other pigs, but the remaining couple charged. The one that reached me first clamped its maw around my leg, not a moment before the next reached it, bit into its neck, and thrashed it back and forth. I couldn't hear my own screams above the countless squeals of the hog pile and the constant wet ripping that resounded through the dark sky. Eventually, the pig that had bit me gave out with a squeal, but not before the lower half of my leg was snapped with one final pull, and the pig behind then buried its face into the body of the dying hog before being dragged back into the conflict by another. I failed to even hear my cries of pain over the sounds of the fray. I knew I screamed only from the burning in my throat. Breathe. A second later, I was thrown by the arm and crashed against the soggy earth several feet away from the conflict. For a moment, I wondered if I was alive, or if the world I was seeing around me was really hell, and I was a damned soul being punished for my sins. At that, I blacked out and entered a timeless, dreamless slumber that sent the world back into the buzzing mayhem I had felt before the carnage. I opened my eyes some brief time later to find that the buzzing persisted in my ears while awake. Perspiring heavily from the heat, I found I was lying on my back on the ground, facing the burning remains of my house. The buzzing was really the rush of flames lapping at the sky and the crackling of embers as the roaring fire pulled them out of sight. Swine! The voice, which rang impossibly clear in the noise of the night, above the roar of the inferno and the sounds of the approaching sirens. had come from but a few feet behind the back of my moist head. Even after all that had transpired, the word made my hair stand on end, and it was spoken with a voice that could snuff out the stars if it were to say that they ought to stop shining. I turned my head to face behind me, groaning sharply from the pain, to see a man atop a mountain of hundreds of mutilated hogs. The pile ran with a constant stream of blood and feces, which dripped slowly over the terraced stack of corpses to form a small lake underneath, the edge of which lapped my face with miniature waves of gore.
"They never learn."
Then the man smiled, and I realized with horror that his legs resembled those of ruminants, and atop his head rested 2 ebony horns, glistening in the moonlight.